Good afternoon, everyone, from Taipei, Taiwan. My name is Scott Persner, and I'm the Director of International Affairs for the Taiwan Wild Bird Federation. And I'd like to welcome everybody to today, the second session of the 2021 Major Topics in International Wild Bird Conservation webinar series. It is a collaboration effort between us and the Taiwan Endemic Species Research Institute, and it was created based off of the recent publication of the 2020 State of Taiwan Birds Report. Now, the State of Taiwan 2020 Birds Report was a landmark in Taiwan bird conservation, the first time such a national report was ever created, and it highlighted a number of different areas regarding birds, the threats that they face, and their conservation status. And a number of those birds, such as the black-faced spoonbill, the Chinese crested tern, and others that we have studies for, such as the northern lapwing, all have one thing in common. They are migratory species, which use the East Asian-Australasian Flyway. This is my segue into the introduction for today's speaker, Dr. Richard Fuller. Now, we are very happy and pleased to be able to welcome Dr. Fuller today with us, and I will just present to you a little bit about him first. So Dr. Fuller is coming to us from the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. He studies how people have affected the natural world around them and how some of their destructive effects can be best reversed. To answer these questions, his lab group, the Fuller Lab, works on pure and applied topics in biodiversity and conservation, spanning the fields of migration ecology, conservation planning, and urban ecology. Much of the work is interdisciplinary, focusing on the interactions between people and nature, how these can be enhanced, and how these relationships can be shaped to converge on coherent solutions to the biodiversity crisis. Today, he will be talking with us about the migratory shorebird conservation that takes place along the East Asian-Australasian Flyway, a topic that, of course, directly affects us here since we are on that flyway ourselves. Before he begins, though, I just want to remind everyone that if you have a question, be sure to put your question in the question and answer box at the bottom, and we will have those questions translated so that way we could discuss them with Dr. Fuller at the end of the session. And so without further ado now, I will pass the virtual floor to Dr. Fuller. Richard, please take it away and share your screen.
Thank you very much, Scott, for the very generous introduction. And it's really a great pleasure to be able to talk with everyone today. Thank you so much for giving up some of your time to attend this webinar today. And I hope it's interesting and useful. And at the outset, I want to say how important the data and the insights that Scott was talking about from Taiwan have been in shaping what we know about migratory shorebirds in this flyway. So I'm based at the University of Queensland, which is in Brisbane on the east coast of Australia. And many of the long distance migratory shorebirds that pass through Taiwan end up in Australia, visit us down here in Australia. And they have been intensively studied throughout Australia. And I'm going to share with you today some of the insights, both from Australia and around the flyway. And let's begin with an example of a migration of one of these amazing shorebirds. This example does not include Taiwan or Australia, but it shows the incredible journeys that these birds undertake. This bird is a bar-tailed godwit, and it was fitted with a satellite tracking device back in 2007. And the researchers fitted the device on the bird while she was in New Zealand. She was feeding on a mudflat in North Island in New Zealand. And at the time of this study, no one knew the migration routes of the bar-tailed godwit. And on the 17th of March 2007, this female bar-tailed godwit took off from the mudflat in New Zealand, which she had spent the austral summer, and she flew 10,300 kilometres all the way to the east coast of mainland China. That is an incredible long distance endurance flight. These birds cannot land on the sea. This was a single powered flight of over 10,000 kilometres. The bird landed on a big tidal flat at Yalujiang in the northern parts of the Yellow Sea, and she spent several weeks feeding as fast as she could to refuel and recover from that long journey and prepare for her next one. And on the 2nd of May, she took off from that mudflat in mainland China and flew 6,500 kilometres across the northern Pacific Ocean to Alaska. And there in Alaska, she went on to the Arctic tundra and laid her eggs and had a breeding attempt. That, of course, coincides with the summer in the Arctic, perfect conditions for breeding. But she had travelled from one side of the world to the other. Then, after she had finished breeding, on the 30th of August, she took off once again. And no one had any idea how these birds got back to New Zealand from the Arctic. And this bird showed how they fly all the way directly across the Pacific Ocean in a journey of about 12,000 kilometres. At the time, this was the longest recorded migration by any non-seabird in the world. An incredible feat of migration. And this bird landed back on the same mudflat from which she had departed all those months earlier. So this individual bird is visiting 3 different countries during its migration. And of course, it depends on finding good quality habitats in all 3 of those locations. But the first point I want to make is just, isn't this amazing? The incredible long distance journeys that these birds undertake, the navigation systems that allow them to find their way across the world is exceptional. And I find it just amazing. So that's the first point I really want to get across. And it's not just one species that's migrating around this flyway. There are dozens and dozens of migratory shorebird species moving around this flyway. In fact, it's such a busy network of migration that this area has been termed the East Asian-Australasian Flyway. It connects East Asia with Australasia, south of the equator. So birds are doing these enormous migrations from the northern hemisphere down into the southern hemisphere and back each year. And there are dozens of species and millions of individual birds that undertake these migrations. In fact, this flyway is the biggest in the world in terms of the numbers of birds involved. And it is also, as we shall see in this talk, the most threatened flyway in the world. So it's a really important area for research and international collaboration. And I want to begin with an example of the threats that migratory species can face. Imagine this diagram is a picture of a migration route of a bird. It can be any bird. Now the bird is moving between these patches of habitat. These might be the breeding grounds at the top, and the bird may be migrating down to some non-breeding grounds down here. Now, in each of these pictures, only 2 places have been lost. 2 patches of habitat have been lost. But you can see that the impact on that species population is highly variable depending on exactly which bit of habitat has been lost. And losses of only small patches of habitat can create big declines in migratory species. If you happen to lose the piece of habitat that they really depend on when they migrate, a species can be in big trouble with only a small amount of its habitat being lost. And if you think about it, what's happening with migratory birds is that they're moving between their breeding grounds to their non-breeding grounds, and often in the middle, they're stopping to refuel and rest along the way. So the birds are using 3 very distinct areas during their annual migration. But in the course of these journeys, they may well traverse several different countries. And if we put these 2 aspects together, this means that the conservation of migratory birds is an international effort. Migratory birds connect different countries with each other. They are threatened by impacts that are occurring in many different countries, and they depend on many different countries collaborating with each other for their conservation. And this will be a theme that we keep coming back to throughout this talk. So migratory species conservation is an international problem, not just one that can be dealt with within a country. And we've been looking across the East Asian-Australasian Flyway, and we've measured how many species are shared by different pairs of countries across the East Asian-Australasian Flyway. And you can see there's some pairs of countries that share very high numbers of species. For example, Russia and Indonesia share more than 30 species of migratory shorebirds that move between them. And these connections between countries are crucially important for the conservation of these species. And we can use analyses like this to help work out which countries need to collaborate with which other countries in terms of their migratory species conservation. And you can see that the connections between Taiwan and a number of other countries around the flyway, some of those are very strong. There's a strong connection between Taiwan and Indonesia, Russia, Australia, and Malaysia in particular. So there is a real international dimension to conserving these species. And we can really measure now the migration routes of birds at a very, very fine scale and using ever more sophisticated technology. The bird you're seeing in this slide is the eastern curlew. It's a very large shorebird species that has an extremely long bill, which it probes into the mud to pick up invertebrates that are living in the mudflats. It's the largest migratory shorebird in this flyway, and it is also one of the most threatened species in this flyway. And because of this, a group of researchers around Australia recently launched a major project to try to understand the migration routes of the eastern curlew. And what you're seeing in these pictures is some curlews being fitted with satellite transmitters that tell the researchers exactly where the bird is at each point in time. So the birds can tell us their migration routes as they're moving around the flyway. This project was a very large collaborative project involving all these organisations you can see here around Australia. And it was led by Amanda Lillyman and Brad Woodworth. Now, the reason we were so concerned about this species is because it's one of the fastest declining species in this flyway. In fact, if there isn't a serious change in its situation, this species is heading towards extinction. Here are some data from Australia over the last 25 years or so. This species has declined by more than 80% in a 30-year period. And it has now been designated as critically endangered in Australia and endangered globally. This species is heading towards extinction unless we can understand why it's declining so fast and do something about it. And crucially, we cannot create that understanding within one country, and we cannot create the conservation that's needed within one country. So I'm terribly worried about this species, and that's why we wanted to learn much more about its migration routes. And here's an example of some of the data that you can get on these satellite tracked individuals. The area you're looking at here is the city of Brisbane, and on the doorstep of our city, we have a very large estuary of 400 square kilometres, and it's called Moreton Bay. It has very large tidal flats, which attract tens of thousands of shorebirds every summer. So I'm very fortunate to live in a city that has many migratory shorebirds very close. And the data you're looking at on this map are the movements of individual eastern curlews as they move between their feeding and roosting sites within Moreton Bay. You can see that these satellite tags now give us such detailed information. We can really use them for local planning as well as international connections among countries. So we've been sharing these data with local management organisations around Australia to help manage the habitats for this bird much better here in Australia. And the first thing I want to say is that this species is heavily threatened by impacts in Australia, right? We begin our story down here in the Southern Hemisphere. There are significant problems with disturbance to eastern curlews in their habitats here in Australia. As you can see from this map, there is lots of coastal development in many parts of Australia, and that's threatening the habitat on which these birds depend. And these kinds of data can help us understand those threats. But of course, they also give us an international picture of what happens when these eastern curlews leave Australia and commence their migrations to the north. Over the last few years, we have satellite tagged eastern curlews from 4 different locations all around Australia. So Moreton Bay here on the east coast of Australia, a site near Melbourne in the southeast of Australia, a site at Darwin in the purple there, and also in Broome in far northwestern Australia. We wanted to know whether the curlews from these different locations across Australia had different migration routes on their way to and from the breeding grounds. And here you're looking at the tracks of each of those 21 migrating eastern curlews. And many birds undertook several years of migrations. You're looking at a lot of data here. And we still have a couple of birds whose tags are still working and they're still migrating. You can see that many of the curlews stop in various locations. The map on the right-hand side shows the locations in which curlews are stopping and resting on the ground, in habitat on the ground. And one of the most important things we've already begun to discover with these data is that curlews stop in lots of places around the flyway. There is a perception that shorebirds migrate to the Yellow Sea and then to the Arctic, and that's all they do. These data are showing that that is not the case. Eastern curlews are stopping in Northern Australia as they leave their non-breeding grounds. They're stopping in Southeast Asia. Look at all those dots across Indonesia and the Philippines. They're stopping in Taiwan, in Southeast mainland China, in extreme southern Japan. Yes, of course, they are stopping for long periods in the Yellow Sea. That is a very important site for them. But many of the birds are also staging in China, in mainland China, in inland wetlands before they reach the breeding grounds. And then they're moving on to the breeding grounds when conditions allow in the spring. So this is now painting a picture of a complex migration that involves many countries and many individual sites around the flyway. Every single bird that we tagged stopped in a place that is not recognised as an internationally important wetland. In other words, all of the birds depend on sites that are not recognised and that are not necessarily protected and managed for shorebirds. And this is very important. It means that shorebirds depend on a very large landscape, not just on a few sites that happen to have large numbers of birds. And several of our curlews have visited Taiwan. Relatively small numbers of eastern curlews get noticed in Taiwan, but actually quite a large proportion of our tagged birds stopped there, suggesting that the population in Taiwan might be bigger than actually realised. And it seems that many of the curlews are stopping for quite short periods while they're passing through Taiwan. So the numbers are possibly being underestimated because of that turnover. So I think Taiwan is an important part of the migration route for the eastern curlew. And it also shows that curlews are being threatened potentially by impacts all across their migration route. And how do we start to understand where those threats are operating? So when the curlews reach their breeding grounds, they're visiting places in the far northeast of mainland China and the far southeast of Russia. And curlews from different parts of Australia have different breeding grounds. This is something that we've just begun to learn. Curlews from the east and south of Australia, in the orange dots on this map, are mainly breeding in northeastern China, in a very impacted part of the country where in Heilongjiang province that has been largely transformed for rice agriculture. And we think that the breeding grounds of this species in mainland China have undergone massive amounts of habitat loss over the last few hundred years. And I think this is one of the important threatening processes for this species. Birds from Northern Australia in the purple dots tend to migrate further north, and they breed in southeastern Russia, which is a much less heavily impacted region and still contains lots of great quality habitat for eastern curlews. So we think there is a strong structure in the migration of the eastern curlews, with different birds moving to different breeding grounds. And we have also found that curlews are declining faster in southern Australia than they are in the north, adding weight to the idea that breeding grounds are an important threat for this species. And here is the location of two nesting eastern curlews on the breeding grounds in the summer. On the left-hand side is a pair of curlews nesting in Russia, You can see there's continuous wilderness in that area, lots of very high quality breeding habitat. On the right-hand side is a pair of curlews nesting in a Ramsar site in northeastern China. And you can see, it's a little bit hard to see, but surrounding that marshland, you can see rice paddies spreading for many, many kilometres. And the birds are finding and breeding in the last remaining natural marshland in that entire region. So breeding habitats for curlews is under significant pressure. Okay. So given that birds migrate these enormous distances, how do we start to understand why they're declining? Because if we want to save them, we have to understand what's causing their declines. Where do we look across the flyway to work out where species are declining? Well, the first thing we need to do is to monitor the species that we care about. And Australia has done a reasonably good job of monitoring migratory shorebirds over the last few decades. It's a big task. Australia is a very big place. It's 7 million square kilometres and it has an incredibly long coastline and only a small human population. But there is good quality monitoring from very large parts of Australia. And we can use that to understand which species are declining and whether those situations are getting better or worse. And Rob Clements, who's pictured here, has undertaken some major national analyses to understand the different population trajectories of different shorebird species. And what you're looking at here is 19 migratory shorebird species for which we have good monitoring data across the whole of Australia. And if that species dot is below the dotted line, that means it's in significant national decline. So 12 out of the 19 shorebird species that we have been able to analyse in Australia are in rapid and significant national decline. It's not just the eastern curlew that's in trouble, it's many, many migratory shorebird species. This appears to be an entire migration system that is in big trouble, and many of the species are declining incredibly fast. And this is very, very concerning. Notice that on this graph, these are annual percentage change, right? So every year, 10% or 6% or 4% of a population is disappearing every single year. That is a very rapid rate of decline for these species that you're seeing here. And there are threats operating all around the flyway. Let's head first of all right to the far north of the migration flyway, and let's think about a different species for a moment. This is the Pacific golden plover. It breeds on the high Arctic tundra. Really, it migrates to the top of the world to breed. And the Arctic is one of the places where the climate is changing more quickly than almost anywhere else in the world. And there is real concern about how climate change will impact migratory shorebirds in the Arctic. And a student at the University of Queensland called Hannah Walker investigated the impact of climate change on migratory shorebirds all around the world. And this is what Hannah did. She mapped the breeding locations for each migratory shorebird species. So here you're looking at data for the Pacific golden plover. The black dots represent nesting sites of the Pacific golden plover. it takes a while to get your head around this map, right? The North Pole is in the middle, and you can see the Russian coastline on the right-hand side. The green area is a modelled estimate of climatically suitable conditions for the Pacific golden plover. And we can use this model to look at the potential impacts of climate change on this species. So this is the present situation. And if I run this model forwards in a changing climate, this is now a map of the distribution of climatically suitable habitat for this species in 2070. What does this mean? This means that in around 50 years, this species will have almost no climatic conditions that are like what it uses today in its breeding grounds. It's going to have to get used to a whole new set of climatic conditions. And that is a big challenge for a species in such a short period of time. The climate is changing very, very fast on the breeding grounds of this particular species, and the same is true for many other shorebird species around the world. This is a map now for all of the Arctic shorebird species around the world, and the darker colours on this map represent places that have suitable conditions for more species, right? So this is the current situation today. And if I run this model forward, it shows that large parts of Arctic Russia will become climatically unsuitable and changed in just 50 years' time. There will be almost no parts of Arctic Russia that have climate like today in only 50 years' time. So I am very concerned about climate change as a threat to migratory shorebirds because they visit areas that are so far north and subject to such rapid climate change. You can see that some of the dark green areas that remain are large parts of Arctic Canada, parts of the coastline of Greenland, and some of the islands off northern Russia and northern Europe. These are likely to be the climatic refugia for these species as our climate begins to change rapidly. But we don't know how shorebirds are going to respond to this rapid change that is coming. And sometimes it terrifies me to think that my children will be alive in 2070 and they will be able to see whether these predictions come true and whether the world has been able to stop a rapidly changing climate. So I really hope that the negotiations happening right now around climate change mitigation really come to fruition. So climate change is a big threat, I think, to migratory shorebirds. Another big threat was studied by Eduardo Gallo, who recently finished his PhD at the University of Queensland. And this threat is hunting. And hunting is a very difficult thing to study. Often hunting is illegal in various parts of the flyway. Often people don't want to say that they've been involved in hunting, and it can be very difficult to gather data on hunting to understand whether it is a problem or how large the problem is. Eduardo spent more than a year gathering documents and information from all around the East Asian-Australasian Flyway, and he found evidence that at least 46 species of migratory shorebird are hunted in this flyway at least 165 different sites all around the flyway. So all of those black dots represent a place where hunting of shorebirds has been documented. And you might think, why would you hunt a shorebird? It seems a very difficult species, kind of bird to hunt. But actually they turn up in very, very big numbers at particular times of year, and they're actually quite easy to catch if you know exactly what you're doing and exactly where to look. So large numbers of shorebirds can be trapped and killed for consumption or for sale in markets. Worryingly, Eduardo found that much of the hunting is current or recent in many parts of the flyway. In some parts it has been stopped. For example, Japan and Australia signed an agreement that both countries would stop hunting of migratory shorebirds. And that was in particular to protect the Latham snipe, which migrates between those two countries. But hunting is ongoing in many other places around the flyway. And I am concerned that it's a significant issue. One problem is we don't have very good data on hunting, but each of those three numbered sites, 1, 2, 3, that you can see on this map, we actually have very good data from those three sites in terms of how many individuals and what species have been hunted. And I'm just showing you data now from those three sites alone. And calculations that Eduardo did that are published in the paper you can see here have shown that at those three sites alone, more than 30% of the sustainable yield of common greenshanks are being harvested. That means 1/3 of the sustainable yield is being taken from just three sites for that particular species. And we know that hunting is happening in probably hundreds and hundreds of sites all around the flyway. So we are really concerned that hunting is an under-documented threat to migratory shorebirds in this flyway. Pacific golden plovers, more than a quarter of the sustainable yield is being taken from just these three sites. And even species like the common sandpiper, for those of you who know that species, it's very surprising, but large numbers of that species, which doesn't even congregate very much, are being hunted. It's quite scary, I think, how widespread and intense the hunting pressure is on shorebirds. So hunting is not just a problem for passerine birds or for land birds in this flyway, it's a big problem for shorebirds too. And we really need to understand it much better and try to slow down hunting in various parts of the flyway. So we've thought about two threats so far. A very large threat to migratory shorebirds is the loss of intertidal habitat around the flyway. On this photo, you can see a very large tidal flat on the right-hand side, but part of that tidal flat has been reclaimed by building a seawall, a long wall of concrete that encloses part of the tidal flat, which is then filled in to create dry land. That land can then be used for various purposes, including aquaculture, agriculture, and urban development, industrial development of various kinds. Now, reclamation is a very serious threat. It directly removes the habitat on which these birds depend. And what you're looking at here is a satellite picture from part of Bohai Bay in mainland China. This picture was taken at low tide in 1975. And this is the same place just 35 years later. And if I flick between those two images, you can see how much of that tidal flat has disappeared over a very short period of time. In the 1975 image, you can see a very broad grey section of intertidal habitat along that coast. All of that had disappeared in just 35 years as a result of very rapid coastal development. And this kind of development is or has been happening in many places around East Asia in particular, but also in many other parts of the flyway, from Australia and New Zealand all the way to Japan and Russia. A PhD student at the University of Queensland called Nick Murray investigated the amount of habitat that has been lost through coastal reclamation. And he used data, satellite data, that were collected by the Landsat satellite in a project that was funded by the Google Foundation. And what Nick has been able to do is produce some of the first ever, well, is the first ever global map of tidal flats. And this work was recently published just last year. And the darker colours on this map show areas of the world that have the largest tidal flats or mud flats. And you can see that East Asia shows up on this global map as being a very important location for major tidal flat systems. So it's no surprise that migratory shorebirds love East Asia and stop in East Asia on their way to and from the Arctic. There are other big tidal flats in several other places around the world, in Europe, in northeastern South America, and in various parts of Africa. But East Asia is probably the world's most significant area tidal flats. So this is a really important ecosystem in this region. Nick Murray also did a more detailed analysis of the Yellow Sea. We've already seen from data I showed you earlier that the Yellow Sea is a critically important stopover site for migratory shorebirds as they move along their migration routes. And you're looking here at a map of the Yellow Sea with the Korean Peninsula on the right-hand side and northeastern mainland China here on the west coast of the Yellow Sea. And the colours represent gain or loss of mudflats over a 50-year period. And these data were created by combining satellite information with high-quality maps of intertidal areas. The red colours on this map are places where the tidal flats have disappeared. And the blue colours, you can just about see some of them, are places where mudflats have increased. You can see that the overall picture is massive loss of tidal flats all around the Yellow Sea region, particularly through South Korea, through many reclamation projects that have happened there, but also through Bohai Bay and parts of the Yellow Sea on the mainland Chinese coast as well. Even parts of the tidal flats in North Korea have seen major losses happening in them over the last 50 years. So this is an ecosystem in big trouble, and we think this is probably the main reason why many of these shorebird species are declining so fast. Misha Jackson, who's a PhD student at the University of Queensland, just finished her PhD, has been working on understanding the impacts of habitat loss on shorebirds and how shorebird habitat can be better managed. This is an image of a reclaimed mudflat taken from the area just north of Shanghai. And it shows the different kinds of uses that happen in reclaimed areas. You can see aquaculture ponds, you can see solar farms, you can see factories beginning to be developed, you can see farmland. You can also see a lagoon there in the bottom right-hand side that has not yet been developed. And shorebirds often find places like that to roost in before they get turned also into aquaculture or agriculture. And you can see when this kind of land use change happens, after a while, there's nowhere else for the birds to go. And the land use changes above the seawall. Misha did some detailed studies and showed that it is possible, even when you have reclamation, to create good quality roosting habitats for shorebirds in these systems. Misha showed that shorebirds prefer wetlands that have shallow water, that have lots of bare mud, that have low amounts of vegetation and very large open areas. And the shorebirds come up to roost on these kinds of wetlands after they have finished feeding on the intertidal mudflats. And what Misha has shown is that it's really important to make sure that you have good quality intertidal habitats for the birds to feed on, but also good quality roosting sites. Because if there is nowhere for the birds to roost over the high tide period, then they cannot live in that area. The shorebirds avoided places that have high water levels, places that have lots of vegetation or structures and buildings, and of course, places that have lots of disturbance. And we're often finding with reclamations that environmental offsets involve creating lakes for birds. And while these lakes are designed to attract waterbirds, they're often useless for shorebirds. They may be very good at attracting ducks, but they're no good for shorebirds. Shorebirds need open, very shallow wetlands. And it's important that the right kinds of wetlands are created for migratory shorebirds. Another big threat to shorebirds throughout East Asia is the invasion of Spartina, which is a grass that invades tidal flats and can cover very large areas of tidal flats very quickly. And this grass doesn't eat birds directly, but it eats the habitats that birds depend on. And the rapid spread of Spartina is a real problem in large parts of East Asia too. So there really are many threats to these shorebirds. And we're finding that this is more work done by Misha Jackson. She showed that many of the places that have high Spartina coverage are also places that have lost a lot of their tidal flats. So places on the top left-hand side of this map, where there's been big loss of mudflats, but also rapid invasion by Spartina. So the message I'm trying to get across is that habitat loss is not just about reclamation, it's about everything that happens around that. It's about loss of mudflats, it's about loss of roosting sites that are suitable for the birds, it's about invasion of the remaining tidal flats by Spartina. There's lots and lots of issues that need management, not just stopping reclamation. Okay, so I'm going to bring all of this together and paint the overall picture. And my talk won't end in tears, I hope. There will be a happy ending, so just wait. First of all, let's bring all of these strands of data together. This is an analysis done by Colin Studds, who was a postdoc at UQ a number of years ago. And this is the analysis that I am most proud of in my career, and I think will be the most important paper that I've ever been involved in writing. And I think it shows very clearly that the main reason for the decline of migratory shorebirds is the loss of habitat in the Yellow Sea. Let me explain what this graph is showing. Each dot on this graph is a different shorebird species, and they're arranged according to how reliant they are on the Yellow Sea. So remember, the eastern curlew migrates, they all migrate through the Yellow Sea, if you remember those maps from earlier on. So the eastern curlew is on the right-hand side. It's one of these dots in the bottom right-hand corner of this graph. It migrates through the Yellow Sea. Now, there are other species, such as the grey-tailed tattler, up on the top left-hand side, which doesn't particularly migrate through the Yellow Sea. They go other ways. Most of them go through Japan on their way to the breeding grounds. So there are some species that don't really use the Yellow Sea on their migration. So what we wanted to do was work out whether is it the species that are migrating through the Yellow Sea that are declining the fastest? And the answer is yes. The y-axis on this graph is the population trend of the species in Australia and New Zealand. And what we found is that the species that migrate through the Yellow Sea are declining really rapidly. And the species that do not migrate through the Yellow Sea are not declining, or some of them are even increasing. So if you migrate through the Yellow Sea, you're in big trouble if you're a migratory shorebird. This strongly suggests to us that the region that is causing these declines, or at least is the strongest effect, appears to be the Yellow Sea rather than other parts of migration flyways. Now, these are difficult analyses to do. It doesn't incorporate all of the other threats that are operating, but I feel that the strongest evidence is that loss of habitat in the Yellow Sea is the main reason why these shorebirds are declining. In this analysis, we investigated a large number of several other variables too, but none of those were able to explain the declines. Simply, if you migrate through the Yellow Sea, you're in big trouble. That was the message that came out of that analysis. So where does this leave us? Well, migratory species are threatened in many parts of their migration flyway, and this means that action needs to be taken in many parts of the migration flyway, right? So threats and actions come from all around the flyway. Now, we've been researching those actions and trying to understand how much collaboration is already happening. And this is work being done by Marina Carella at UQ currently. And Marina has been mapping the extent to which different countries are engaged in international migratory species agreements. And there is enormous variation around the world in the extent to which different parts of the world are engaging in international environmental agreements on migratory bird conservation. That's one thing. The second thing, looking within the East Asian-Australasian Flyway, there are more and more governments talking with each other and signing bilateral and multilateral international agreements with each other. There are more and more NGOs being involved in multilateral discussions around shorebird or migratory bird conservation. So within the East Asian-Australasian Flyway, we have one of the most intense international diplomatic efforts to try to conserve migratory birds. And I'm very happy about that. And these efforts are continuing to grow. And I think, this international webinar is one example of that international communication and collaboration. What we have been able to show, though, is that those international discussions are focused much more on some threats than others. So the thicknesses of the lines on this graph shows you how much discussion is happening between countries around particular issues. And habitat conservation is being discussed very extensively, which is good. But other issues such as hunting are not being talked about as much. And we need to get these other threats kind of onto the agenda as well of these international agreements. These agreements can be very successful. I mentioned the agreement between Japan and Australia to stop hunting the Latham snipe, which is the bird pictured here. After that agreement was signed, the Latham snipe changed from being a declining species that was in big trouble to a species that was again increasing and very much stabilised its population. So this stuff works. If countries can work together to reduce threats, we can turn around these declining populations and turn them into successful conservation stories. So it can be done, but we just all need to work together to make it happen. And there have been some big efforts within the Yellow Sea region in particular to identify and protect the remaining important habitats in that very important part of our flyway. There are several influential reports that created information about which areas needed to be protected. There have been a number of announcements from mainland China about restrictions on reclamation of tidal flats, and that has been a good thing. It remains to be seen, exactly how that slows down the amount of reclamation, but at least steps are being made in the right direction in stopping and slowing down reclamation. So I think there are some causes for hope at the end of this. There's a number of World Heritage sites that have now been nominated and declared in the Yellow Sea. So I think conservation efforts are increasing. If you look, the black line on this graph represents the populations of these shorebirds, which are in really big decline. And the red line represents our conservation efforts. And I think we're in a race against time. Can our conservation efforts get ramped up quickly enough to stop the declines in these shorebird species before it's too late? On the one hand, I'm pessimistic because I see how quickly these species are declining. On the other hand, I'm optimistic because I see lots of international collaboration and I see lots of success stories from around the flyway too. So that's me finished. What are the key takeaways from this? Well, shorebirds were here a long time before we were. And we have impacted the habitats of shorebirds all along their amazing migration routes. And the birds are threatened in all parts of their migrations. It's not just a single place or a single country that is responsible here. There is a great collaborative network for conservation in this flyway, but we don't yet have a very clear understanding of what conservation actions we need to take in different places. There's an urgent need to work out what species are threatened by what threats and where. What do we need to do about it? Action is underway, but we really need to accelerate the extent and the amount of effort conservation that's happening around the flyway. And I thank you all for setting aside some time to think about these issues with me here. And I thank you all for your efforts and interest in migratory shorebirds. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for that speech, Richard. That was really, really wonderful. There's lots of different things to go ahead and discuss based off what you shared with us for the last hour. So many different topics, from hunting to climate change to habitat loss. But I'm very glad that you ended on a happier note. And so, in order to delve a bit more into this, we have a guest moderator to help us to talk with you a bit more about the topic. And so today we have Dr. Yuan Xiaowei from National Taiwan University. She's with the School of Forestry and Conservation Research. Now, the both of you actually have two things in common, at least. The first is that Dr. Yuan has worked on conserving migratory bird species, especially also along the EAF with the Chinese crested tern. And also the two of you share a student, Lin Dali. He was Dr. Yuan's master's student, and he's currently your PhD student, and he's listening right now. So I'm sure that he's getting a kick out of this.
Hello, Dali.
And so, Dr. Yuan, what I was hoping we could do is, if possible, you would be able to ask Richard some question or make some comment about his speech, and then give him time to go ahead and respond to you. And perhaps, Richard, if you'd like, you could even ask Dr. Yuan a question as well about things going on here in Taiwan. And that can get the ball rolling so that we could do this. And so we have about a half hour for this. And so Dr. Yuan?
Sure, yes, thank you, Scott. And actually, this is the first time Richard and we meet online. I heard a lot about you and your work, but just kind of today is the time we can have some dialogues. We know that we share common birds, the birds in Taiwan, and also show up in your country. And also your study is kind of very broad, cover the East Asia-Australia Flyway and cover many, many countries. So, listening to your talk is very impressed, and also really kind of alert us that how much important it is, for different country, for the networking and collaboration among different country and different scientists. First of all, I have a question to ask Richard. That you talk about the hunting, habitat loss, and other negative impact on the birds. And I wonder that how about the light? You didn't really mention much about the light effect, because we know now, the light pollution is another issue that people feel a bit alert, and especially a lot of shorebirds, when they migrate, they maybe migrate at night. So do you think that is a possible negative impact, or do you know any people really study on this light pollution issue? Do I need to translate into Chinese, or
no? You don't need to translate. We have the simultaneous translation.
Okay, super. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. That's thank you for your kind words. And it's really great to have this chance to spend some time talking with you today. That's really exciting and wonderful. Look, I think it's a really interesting question. We don't really know, I don't think, what the impacts of light pollution are on shorebird migrations themselves. It is entirely possible that there are impacts of light pollution. Some shorebirds, there have been studies of light pollution impacts on foraging in shorebirds, and many of those have shown that light pollution can extend the foraging periods of many shorebirds and allow them to forage at night in places where they otherwise couldn't. And that's kind of a strangely almost positive effect. But I think you're right that, the coastline of East Asia lights up at night. You can see it from satellites. It's really, really a major issue. And I don't know of any studies really that have tried to work out whether there are problematic effects. of light pollution on the migrations. It would be an interesting thing to study, and perhaps with some of this high resolution satellite tracking data that we have, it may be possible to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. So also, when we look at this migratory birds, the threat they're facing, so we can see one part is like a natural cost because of global climate change and change some landscape, and maybe the water rise up, etc. Those kind of or the temperature change. So for this kind of natural impacts, how about, do you think that the temperature really warming up, right? How that's going to affect the birds, the shorebirds migrate, and also between the breeding ground and also the wintering ground?
Yes, so I think the effects of climate change are different in different stages of the migration, right? So taking the breeding grounds first, temperatures are rising fast in the Arctic, as we all know, and one of the big consequences of that is a melting of the surface layer of the permafrost. And that causes the surface to dry out, the surface of the Arctic tundra. And that means that it becomes unsuitable for shorebird breeding. Shorebirds feed on aquatic invertebrates that are in the marshes. And as the surface dries out, the area becomes unsuitable for breeding shorebirds. They can't find enough food in those places. So that's a very direct effect of temperature on conditions in the Arctic tundra. So that's an example of the direct effect. There are also many, I think, indirect effects of climate change on migratory birds. The most obvious one for shorebirds is sea level rise. And the sea level is rising very rapidly in some parts of our flyway. It may surprise people to learn that sea level does not rise uniformly around the world. It rises quicker in some places than others. And this can cause major losses of intertidal habitats. And we think it may be the reason why so many tidal flats have disappeared around the world in the last few decades. It could at least be part of the reason. And of course, when we have sea walls and other kinds of built infrastructure on the coastline, as the sea level rises, that squeezes the intertidal habitat narrower and narrower, so that you can get habitat loss through sea level rise. Thirdly, we also know that climate strongly influences migration decisions by birds, and birds use signals from the climate to time their migrations and so on. And it has been shown in many migratory birds that changes in the climate can disrupt their migration systems. And that remains a possibility for shorebirds as well. Most of the studies of that have been done on land birds, but I think it's almost certainly a big issue for shorebirds as well. So I think climate change has very many effects and very different effects in different parts. Imagine, many of the shorebirds, these long distance ones, come to Australia in what is winter for you, but is summer for us. And so a curlew sandpiper, for example, might be spending the non-breeding season in a lake in Western Australia in temperatures of 48 degrees C, and in a place that is subject to increasing temperature through climate change. So the shorebirds have to be able to cope with extremely hot conditions in the southern hemisphere, and may really be at the limit of their physiological tolerance, if you like. So I guess it's another problem for migrants, is that things like climate change can impact them in different ways in different parts of their migration.
Yeah, indeed. So your statement is right. I mean, those migratory bird species they're really facing a lot of threat. Such a brave birds. They fly such a long distance and then cross different country and ocean body, and then each place, each segment can have some threat, and they have to face to conquer the threat. So as I mentioned, that one part is that we call global climate change kind of natural cause, and we also see a lot of is the human cost. Like you mentioned, hunting, habitat loss, and then one thing is the development, economic development, because still we can see in Taiwan, in China, just so many factory, a harbor, and so those coastal line you can see it's kind of decreasing gradually. I don't know. What do you think about that? How can we stop that? Because people are crying, say, "Oh, economic growth is so important, and you cannot only take care of the birds. You have to take care of the human being at first." They always use this kind of saying. So, what's your opinion about this? What can we do more?
Well, it's a very good question and a very difficult question to answer. I think I'll begin by saying I think we depend on nature. Humans depend on nature for almost every part of our lives. And that is really important. And I know there are many bird watchers on this call, and I'm sure almost everyone on this call is here because they love nature and they know that nature is good for them. They know that nature underpins our economies and our societies. So the first thing to say is that nature is not some kind of optional extra. If nature dies, we all die, right? And I think this is an argument that is incredibly important for all of us to understand, I think. And I think it's important that conservation, so coastal environments are very, very difficult spaces because they are very complex. There are many jurisdictions that overlap. There are many different groups of people that want to use coasts for different purposes. And they're very crowded places. And what I think is needed is integrated decision making, where we look at coasts at a regional level and we say, right, we need ports, we do need some level of coastal infrastructure that supports economic output, but we need to put those developments in sensible places, right, where they're not going to have enormous impacts on biodiversity and therefore harm other parts of humanity, right? And then we need to work out where are the sensible places to do economic development, where are the sensible places to set aside for conservation, and where are the multi-use places that we can use for several kinds of activities at the same time. Coastlines are very important in providing things like fisheries, for protecting cities from severe weather events and sea level rise. And often nature-based solutions are the best ones for ensuring that coastlines are able to protect humans into the future too. So I think there's really a need for different decision makers to talk much more closely with each other on these issues and plan coasts in a more regional, holistic way.
Yeah, you mentioned about that we human cannot, we have to rely on nature. That's exactly, in Taiwan, the bird club always say, 今日鸟类,明日人类. Today you see the bird's life is kind of predict humans' life in the tomorrow. So exactly that's what you said. But that can remind me one thing you talk about, to pick the sensible place to have some development, but let's say that the rest part, the the birds' needs for, to save for the birds, either for their breeding ground, wintering ground, or migratory stopover place. But I just thought about, in Taiwan, do you know that we're going to put a lot of offshore those fengji, what do you call that?
Wind turbines.
Yeah. So it's going to occupy a lot of space, the physical space. You can see cover a lot of offshore area, and then along the coastal line. So what do you think about that? And is any kind of strong evidence to say that this windmills will affect the migratory birds and their behavior?
There's lots of evidence from Europe about impacts of wind turbines on birds. It's extremely variable. It depends on the kinds of birds involved, and it depends on the precise way in which the wind farms are set up. I think the evidence is very, very weak from our flyway. There's almost nothing from our flyway on wind turbine impacts. We're having the same discussions here in Australia. There are plans for very big offshore wind farms, and there is very little environmental evidence on which to base those decisions. And in many ways, it's a terrifying experiment, right? We're going to set up these giant things and hope it doesn't cause massive destruction. And that's a bit worrying. So I would say the evidence is weak. I think purely shorebirds, I'm not too worried as long as they're offshore and well away from tidal flats. But there are many other species that I'm very worried about. Black-faced spoonbill is a good example of a species that could be seriously threatened by wind turbines. It's a large species that has, quite a slow sort of flight, could easily be heavily impacted. They fly across the strait quite a lot. And it's species like that that are going to be in serious harm's way, I think. I think one can, it would be worth trying to model or to count up, what species are crossing that area, which ones might be threatened, and trying to make some arguments around how the wind farms could be designed to reduce those impacts, but also really to try to monitor the wind farms as they get developed, to try to measure quickly what the impacts are. But really there's very little evidence, and it's hard to create evidence until you have major wind turbines to study.
Yeah.
And it is emerging so quickly here in Asia as well. So a lot of times when we have our meetings, we'll talk about what's going on in Taiwan, because I'm not sure if you'd heard this, but they're trying to have 20% of Taiwan's energy come from green energy sources by 2025. And so a large portion of that will probably be offshore wind, because Taiwan has the same population as Australia, but is much, much smaller than Australia. Yeah. So in order to get that going, they have to put it offshore. And so, like you said, it's an extreme experiment of sorts, because, we've had people approaching us, at least at TWBF, asking us what's going on. And, it's a tricky kind of dance, because, like you said, you want to have a situation where the environmental impact has been assessed properly and that you go in the correct pathway before you go ahead and do building. But at the same time, they want to move quickly into green energy. So it's a balance, like you were saying.
I agree. And I think at the very least, one can use radar studies and other detailed studies to look at how many birds are passing through the areas which are proposed for development. Radar technology is excellent and really can give you very detailed information. And my view, and I'm not just talking about Taiwan here, my view is that developers should be held to very high standards for estimating what the impacts of their developments might be. And I think the tools do exist to estimate how many birds and what kinds of species might be impacted. And I think developers should be being told to come up with that information and create those estimates before permission is given for developments to go ahead.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Scott, sorry.
Oh no, I just also wanted to share with you that speaking about climate change, it's a topic that's been coming up here in Taiwan more and more as well. So actually in the State of Taiwan Birds, one of the sections discusses how birds in Taiwan, including different types, if they might be migratory land birds, might actually be impacted by the effects of climate change. But measuring climate change's effect on bird species is also not as easy to go ahead and do, depending on what kind of habitat they use and which areas they use. So it's also coming around here. So that's why we're so happy to be able to be talking with you today to kind of see what kind of things are going on in Australia in terms of the way that researchers are looking at how to assess climate change's impact on birds, and especially because we all share the same flyway.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. I thought we have a question from the audience. I just
Dr. Nguyen, it's okay. We're going to do that after this discussion period.
Sure, yeah. But one thing is kind of similar to this is because of the green energy in Taiwan, we try to run into use the green energy so quickly. So we actually set up a lot of solar panels and cover a lot of wetlands and a lot of even very good farmland. So I think probably this is not a problem in Australia because you have big land, so you can put a solar panel, cover big piece of land is okay. But then here in Taiwan, it's a problem. A lot of people are come up to protest about these solar panels because it does kind of cover a lot of wetland and also farmland. So I don't know if you know about this or you have any opinion and suggestion about that.
Yes, it's again one of those difficult conservation dilemmas, right? Because one of the motivations for solar farms is limiting climate change. So it's a difficult one. Again, I think it comes down to effective planning. And because solar is a land-hungry technology, it needs to be planned carefully, and it needs to be used in situations where I suppose that's the best land use. And of course, solar panels can be fixed to things like buildings, and that's a good way of using space, which is otherwise unsuitable for biodiversity. Yeah. One wonders if we can start to create super connected, urban power stations on roofs and just somehow reimagine solar energy in a way that doesn't involve enormous land use that is just for that purpose. So I think we perhaps need to be more imaginative about how we deploy solar and about how we create incentives, because it may be easier for a farmer to farm electricity than it is to do something else with it, depending on what the economic incentive structure is like. So I think with renewable energies, and of course the wind turbines are another aspect of this same issue. In general, I suppose it's a good thing because we've got to do something about climate change and we need to do it quickly. But again, like any sort of development, we've just got to do it sensibly and find the right places.
Okay. So Dr. Yuan, I was wondering, we're about to move on to the question and answer session. You did a very good segue there. So I was wondering, though, if you have any final thought or a question that you would like to ask Richard before we move on to that part?
Sure. Just the last quick question that's about the citizen scientist, because Dali has involved into this citizen scientist, and maybe his thesis is going to do something relevant to this citizen scientist. I wonder that in Australia, because in Taiwan, people are very engaged into doing this, but then of course, sometimes the data quality maybe is not that good, or it all depends on how much labor you put in and if you are expert. You are very good. You can record the true data, but maybe somebody, the data quality is not that good. So I wondered, how about in Australia? Do you use a lot of citizen scientists, this kind of approach to help you to monitor the bird population and some research?
So everything that I've presented in this seminar is based entirely on citizen science.
That's right.
Everything. Without citizen science, we would know basically nothing about biodiversity in Australia and really around most of this flyway. So it's crucial. It's absolutely crucial. And in terms of, so community groups in Australia have been monitoring shorebirds since the 1960s. The government hasn't done that. It's been citizen scientists that have been doing it. And I know in Taiwan, there's a really interesting crossover. The government is organising and facilitating citizen science, which is a really wonderful sort of partnership, right? And I think when governments start getting involved, then that really adds power and scale to citizen science as well. So I think citizen science is utterly crucial for understanding change in biodiversity and for doing things quickly. You have an annual state of Taiwan's birds. This is coming out. This is information that is coming out all the time and is keeping your finger on the pulse of what's happening. And I think only citizen science can do that. And in terms of data quality, I think it's no longer even a conversation to have. I think I know very many amateur bird watchers who, they have normal jobs. They're accountants or plumbers, or they just have regular jobs and they're bird watchers in their spare time. Those people know more about birds than most professional scientists that I know, and they create better quality data than many of the professional scientists that I know. So I think citizen science is absolutely crucial for the next stage in conservation. And I've been deeply excited to hear about the scale of citizen science efforts in Taiwan. And I think it's a great model for the rest of the flyway in terms of what it can achieve and how it can be organised as an effective partnership between government and NGOs. So I think you may get the impression that I love citizen science, and that's because I do. And I think it's really the only source now of high quality information.
Yeah, great. I'm so glad to hear that. And I believe all the audience, in this meeting, in this conference, because a lot of them are amateur birders, but amateur means they have their real job, but then they are not amateur at all. They are experts in watching birds, identify birds. So I think they are so happy to hear that. And also I'm really, really give a high respect to the bird clubs people in Taiwan, because, you know that every county we have a bird club. And it's like a non-government organization, and the people are really get engaged into watching birds. So I'm really proud of my people in Taiwan. And so just want to let you know, really glad to hear your talk. And I believe myself and also all the audience are learn a lot from you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. I'll give the floor back to Scott, right? Yeah.
Oh. Thank you so much, Dr. Yen. That was really, really a great discussion period. And thank you so much for also bringing up the topic of citizen science here, which is, one of the main areas which we at TWBF also work with TESRI and our partners, the Wildbird side of Taipei and the Wildbird side of Kaohsiung, to go ahead and host the Taiwan New Year bird count, which has been running for over 8 years now and actually has been a continuous view of the wintering avifauna of Taiwan and its outlying islands. And a lot of the information that we give, it's open data, so the world can see it. And so we really hope, though, that it is helpful so that people can understand. And it's just doing the little part, because it takes a lot of little parts to go ahead and create the big picture, right? And so that is the hope. So actually, this is going to begin the Q&A session for you. And so The first question actually kind of relates to this. And so the first question for you is, what can Taiwan do to help promote the communication and cooperation for conservation of migratory shorebirds and waterbirds along the EAAF?
First of all, continuing to do what you already do. I think, as our discussion just ended up just now, that Taiwan really is setting an example of how to do this stuff. Taiwan is reaching out to other nations around the flyway. It's creating open data sources that Scott just mentioned that anybody can use and can be joined with other databases and that really help create flyway-wide data on our birds that is really important for understanding why they're threatened and what can be done about it. So first of all, continuing to collect high quality data and sharing that data with the world has to be one of the first and most important things to do. And some of those connections between us are just so powerful. One of our eastern curlews landed in Taiwan and was found on the ground by local bird watchers there. And I think that speaks to that human connection, right? The connection between people in different parts of the flyway. Yes, we need our governments to be talking with each other, but we also need to be talking with each other and collaborating with each other to share our experiences of conservation and of how to deal with threats to biodiversity. More of what is already happening is just brilliant.
Well, we at TWBF, and I'm sure a lot of the folks watching today, really hope that this is a good starting point to maybe have more dialogues with you and your lab, maybe, or to maybe eventually do a talk with each other about citizen science projects that you and your lab, or folks that in the organizations in Australia, can maybe learn more about what we're doing here. And we could also learn what's going on over there, because I know that there's a lot of interest to also better understand the way that people are doing citizen science projects in Australia as well.
Well, I know for sure that Australia will learn more from Taiwan than the other way around.
Wow, you're just saying that for the audience now, I'm pretty sure. Oh, but okay, thank you very much. That's really, really nice. The next question, before when we were discussing the windmills and the connections there, do you have any information about research results that you are aware of about windmills and their connection or impact on bird populations, especially migratory bird populations?
Look, I must confess I'm not across all the literature in that area. So my advice would be to search particularly for European literature around that. I'm not across the latest science, okay, unfortunately.
Oh, no, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. It's understandable. It's just a very, very popular topic of discussion here in Taiwan, especially considering the green energy projects that are coming up. But the next question for you is, can you share anything about the current status and work of the conservation efforts for Nordman's greenshank, spoonbill sandpiper, and oriental stork in East Asia?
Again, those species don't visit Australia, so I spend less of my time thinking about those. But the spoonbill sandpiper story in particular is just so impressive. And that's been a real collaboration between scientists and on-ground action. It's been great to see cross-fostered birds transported to Russia and that are now breeding successfully. There's been some stabilization in the numbers of spoonbill sandpiper, although I believe the most recent data is that they're on the decline again. So there does appear to be fresh concern around the spoonbill sandpiper in particular. And that is obviously, that's the shorebird species in the flyway, which is closest to extinction. So it's a very worrying story, but there is a great international team of researchers working on it.
Yeah, and I mean, here in Taiwan, there's usually one or two each year that will sometimes stop over in various parts of Taiwan. So I know Jinmen Island, which is one of Taiwan's outlying islands, they will get records of spoonbill sandpipers sometimes in April. However, last year, or early this year, in Tainan, in southern Taiwan, in one of the wetlands over, it's old salt pans. They also recorded a spoonbill sandpiper. But yeah, that they definitely do not make their way down to Australia. I do know that. But do you have any information about the recent efforts then with the eastern curlew? How are things going with that conservation plan?
So, I mean, I think good in the sense that the big threats to it. So there has been an international action plan developed for the eastern curlew, which was signed off by a number of countries, which was a great step forward. And the eastern curlew has certainly been helped by the World Heritage nominations and by decisions to reverse some of the reclamation plans in mainland China, especially the area around Taozini, just north on the Jiangsu coast there. So I think those have been very important steps forward for the eastern curlew. There are still developments in Australia that are potentially impacting eastern curlew that need to be assessed carefully. So I think it's a mixed story, but there's on other threats around hunting, there really hasn't been much progress in dealing with that so far. But it has been raised, it's being talked about more and more, but we really need to get towards a situation where hunting is really being addressed. We're about to start a new analysis which will analyse all the latest data for eastern curlews to tell us whether their decline is now stabilising or not. So hopefully within a few months we'll have that information to really start to work out whether the conservation measures have been successful in slowing down the decline.
Oh, that would be great. Please share that with us when you find that out. And actually, what you were just saying leads into the next question here, number 4. Compared with in the past, is the impact of human hunting on waterfowl along the migration route of the EAF more serious now? And if so, what are the reasons for that?
It's a good question. On the one, they're less serious and more serious, right? So they're less serious because I think fewer birds are now being taken than was the case before. But I think the reason for that is because the birds have declined so fast. So there are fewer birds to hunt, right? So there are reports of, in Australia, there were old reports from a couple of 100 years ago of eastern curlew flocks so big they would, just be able to shoot curlews out of the sky easily, and the flocks would just be so enormous. And they're now more or less extinct from large parts of Australia. But hunting can't be as big a problem in some places because the declines have been so fast. I think another reason why hunting is now more serious is because the impact on the populations is now much bigger because those populations are so small. I mean, even hunting just a few curlews is creating a potentially quite big impact on that species. And also technology is getting better. Different technologies that can now be used to catch the birds are very efficient and can catch large numbers of birds. So that's problematic too.
Okay, no, thank you for that. Question number 5 we have is, when large amounts of birds migrate simultaneously and the chance of virus pathogens or other parasitic organisms transmission is high, is there anything a bird conservationist can do to protect vulnerable or endangered bird populations?
Good question. It's certainly true that not so much, I mean, shorebirds do transmit some of the diseases of concern. Not many. A lot of them are through waterfowl in particular. I suppose from a management point of view, one approach would be to try to separate out populations of migratory waterbirds that you think might be vulnerable to spreading disease, and maybe having them in, focusing conservation of those species in habitats where they're separated from other potentially vulnerable species. I think it's difficult from a conservation perspective. It's quite hard to imagine how you could really stop it, to be honest, the transmission of diseases across species.
In large flocks, where you have very large mixed flocks, in order to try and separate one from the other, it's probably not the easiest thing to do without disturbing a lot. Yeah, understandable. Okay, so for question number 6, we have, what are the possible most effective conservation actions at stopover sites that can be taken, such as in places like Taiwan? In particular, is conserving man-made high tide roosting sites critical, like the concrete levees that are used in aquaculture?
Yeah, so yes, I think that is one of the most important suggestions that's right there. Often, and I tried to sort of mention it a bit in the talk, but often when we get reclamation and coastal development, we focus on the loss of intertidal habitat. But what can also be a real problem is the loss of roosting sites above the high tide mark. And we really noticed that here in Australia, in the highly urbanised parts of Australia, that the shorebirds have nowhere to roost anymore. And many of their natural roosting sites have disappeared. And the same is certainly true in Taiwan. And effective conservation and management of suitable places for shorebirds to roost is a really important local intervention. So making sure that those coastal wetlands they may be artificial, and that's fine, but making sure they have the right conditions for migratory shorebirds to roost in is, I think, a very important local conservation action that can be taken all around the flyway. And even if a site has a few tens of birds or a couple of hundred birds, that's still a site where birds are stopping on their migration, right? We shouldn't be just focusing on sites that have huge numbers of birds. Yes, we need to protect those, but we also need to think about all of the local sites, the thousands of local sites all around the flyway, because I think ultimately that's what these birds need, is a very large network of places where they can rest and refuel.
Well, in many ways, I feel like Taiwan is a good example of that kind of effort, because as we said before, Taiwan is not very big, but you have places in Taipei like the Guandu Nature Park, which is only 55 hectares, and you have a place in Zhangjun Wetland in Tainan, which is only 200 hectares. But yet, these are really important spots for stopping over or for wintering birds. They're not the biggest, but they're still very important. And so it's hard, though, sometimes, because have you ever had the discussions about saving just very large pieces that are already there as opposed to many little pieces?
Yeah, yes, and I think ultimately we have to do both. We do have to make sure that the really big sites are protected. I mean, a site that has 100,000 birds going through it is an important place and has to be protected. But that doesn't mean that sites that are smaller are not worthy of efforts. Everywhere is needed to create a landscape through which these birds can migrate. As you saw with those curlew satellite tracks, they don't just fly from Australia and land in the Yellow Sea. They stop in all kinds of places through New Guinea, through the Philippines, Taiwan, through Southeast mainland China. They're stopping in lots of places along the way, and almost every individual migrating bird is stopping in at least one place that is not regarded as an internationally important site. That means that all of these unimportant sites are actually important.
Makes a lot of things important. Okay, so this kind of leads into the next question here, though, which is, with habitat loss and climate change, will stopover sites along migration routes become even more important? And how can we evaluate such habitats where birds have such short residence times and large population fluctuations?
Yeah, I mean, very good questions. I think I think as habitat becomes more and more scarce, then the remaining sites are going to become more and more important proportionally. And the second part of the question was about how do we evaluate that when there's lots of birds moving through. And it's really important in stopover sites. There's a very high turnover of birds. You may go out each day and see 100 birds every day, but they could be a different 100 birds every day if there are birds passing through all of the time. And simply counting the birds does not tell you that information. And that's an example where collaboration with scientists can really help, particularly if birds can be banded, and then you can then estimate how many birds are passing through. So if you have records of colour marked or tagged individuals, those kinds of databases can be really important for working out how many birds are passing through an area, where just counting the birds doesn't always tell you that information.
Yeah, actually, just from doing the NYBC, the organizers were able to note that, you know, there are 3 specific migratory bird hotspots in Taiwan, in the northeast, in the Lanyang Plain in Yilan, and then the Changhua Coast, which is Taiwan's largest mudflats, and then the south in the Jianan Plain. But then also, if you go to the island of Jinmen, it could be up to 140 different species during the winter time. You know, so many migrant birds. And in Matsu, this tiny island of Dongyin, it's actually a great place for birding in the spring because you have the Palearctic migration. I've heard you're a birder, so you might be interested in this spot when you get the chance to come to Taiwan.
Well, I'm desperate to come and visit, so I'm looking forward to my first time.
We welcome you. If you come, we will help you set it up. Don't you worry about that. Okay, sorry. Next question. How much protected coastal area would you estimate is needed to protect the migratory shorebirds on the East Asia-Australasian Flyway?
That is an exceptionally interesting question, actually, and I haven't thought about that as hard as I should have done. That's a really good question. I like it, and we should maybe do some analysis around that. The first thing that is obvious to me is that so many of these species have declined so fast. That tells me we need everything that we've currently got. Even if we save everything that we've still got, that may only just stop the decline and not get the birds back to where they were before, right? So arguably we need all of it. It is really my answer, I think, because the habitat loss has caused such a fast decline. Really, we need to protect everything that's left, especially in the major stopover regions. And we need to think about restoring and creating more intertidal habitat to replace what we've lost.
Has there been a lot of work to try and replace intertidal habitat in areas?
Yes, there have been some attempts to do it. There's been some in Europe, there's been some in Australia, some in Hong Kong. So it can be done, but it's difficult and expensive using current technology. I think it's an area where there needs to be a major R&D effort to work out how to do it at scale. I think it is possible. It's possible to re-engineer coastlines, which is what this is about. If we can do these major reclamation projects, surely we also have the engineering capability to recreate tidal flats. And I think we need to invest much more in the technology and the engineering around doing that. And we could also think about, in certain places, realigning seawalls, possibly breaching seawalls and rerouting the coastline, and perhaps creating more tidal flats through seawall retreat.
Yeah, it's just easier to keep what's already there instead of trying to create it once it's been taken away.
Well, in some places, the seawalls are not very well constructed and are going to need very serious maintenance, which could be exceptionally expensive. And in some of those places, it may be better to breach the seawall and allow new tidal flat to emerge. And there could be opportunities to create some really nice nature reserves with that kind of approach.
Okay. So the next question for you is that the general public do not really feel attached to shorebirds in Taiwan, which might result in lesser conservation resource allocation. Do you think that this is a great concern in terms of helping reverse the declining trend of shorebird populations?
It's a very interesting point, and that has been a real problem in Australia as well. And it's true of, I think, environmental issues all over the world. It's not specific to shorebirds or Taiwan or any particular, if all of us cared, then things would change more quickly. That is difficult. And in Australia, I think it's been very interesting to watch this in Australia over the last 15 years. Initially, shorebirds were a very, very narrow topic, that it was only really of interest to birders and, shorebird people who are obsessed with shorebirds. But over the years, the eastern curlew was kind of adopted as a flagship species for shorebird conservation. And that helped raise the profile of shorebirds, both among the general public and also in the Australian government. And the eastern curlew has now been listed as one of Australia's top 100 priority threatened species. And that kind of high profile at government level has helped drive a lot of public awareness as well. And Australia's national NGOs have also got behind the eastern curlew. So there's become this kind of joined up messaging around eastern curlew as a flagship species. It's easier to tell a story about one species than it is about a whole group of strange birds called migratory shorebirds, right? And I think globally, the spoon-billed sandpiper has been a good flagship species for shorebirds globally. So maybe trying to identify something that, represents shorebird conservation in Taiwan and focusing around some kind of flagship species might help.
Well, the black-faced spoonbill has become a flagship species in Taiwan, especially for bird and wetland conservation, and also international cooperation for migratory birds. So that definitely has come to that point, but that is because the process started in the 1990s. So it's had a lot of time to go ahead and develop. And now government officials, if you go into Tainan or if you go to various places where they've been expanding to, everybody likes to talk about the black-faced spoonbill, but it's also because they're very big, very noticeable, and very charismatic with their feeding behavior as well. So it might be a conversation to have where you need to think of a different species that might also be able to represent shorebirds.
I think that's possible, but it's also true that shorebirds overlap with black-faced spoonbill, habitat in quite significant ways. And, there may well be ways of, on the back of the black-faced spoonbill efforts, to also have conversations around shorebird habitat, coastal habitat for lots of wetland birds.
It's definitely a conversation that's taking place now, especially with the green energy, because the places where spoonbills use Nordman's greenshanks also use that spoonbill sandpiper, red stint, grape knot, Saunders's gulls, these kinds of species. So it's an interesting topic to go ahead and further develop. Okay, we have the last question for you. The last question was an interesting remark about the loss of roosting places. Could floating platforms or even in something in the form of an anchored ship adapted for this purpose be used as a solution?
Oh, a ship, I like that. That's a really cool idea.
Birds on boats, yes.
So BirdLife Australia has been trialling floating roosts as an alternative. With quite some success. In Korea, they tried deploying floating roosts in Korea, and they got used by quite large numbers of birds. And so it can be done, and in some circumstances it might work. But we've also had a few trials of them near Brisbane here, which haven't been so successful. So I think it's going to depend on, they may work in some places and not in others. But they're quite low cost and they could be tried in different places. Something bold like a ship, I love that. That's just a really nice, ambitious kind of idea and would be a very iconic thing to do. That's also interesting. I think these kinds of things can be made to work if they're deployed carefully and in the right places. There's one risk that needs to be managed, though, and that is creating the idea that we can just destroy a roosting site because we can just have a floating roost instead. So I think we need to be careful not to promote these as easy, simple offsets that can be used to excuse loss of roosting sites. I think they should be used in a last resort and in situations where there's no other way of creating a roosting site. It's actually quite easy to create roost sites for shorebirds. They're quite easy to build and to engineer. There's plenty of clear guidance on how to do it and thousands of examples from around the world. So I think the best way to do it is to engineer one using big heavy machinery and creating habitat that we know will work.
Okay.
Things like floating roosts, I think, can be used in situations where that's not possible or where you need a sort of temporary measure before other actions are taken.
Okay. No, thank you. No, thank you for this information, and it's really interesting to go ahead and learn so much. Very sad that we have to start our closing remarks and things now. So before we say goodbye and thank you, we were wondering if we could maybe just take a group photo. So with Dr. Yuan, if okay, see, we've set up our thing here. Oh, I'm not in the photo frame anymore. That's very sad. But okay, we will just go ahead and take the photo as, oh, there we are. Okay, great. So if Chen-Ting, if you'd like to go ahead and just speak and let us know when we could go ahead and, oh, it's Scott Lynn from Tessry. Hi, Scott. And so if you want to let us know when you could take the picture, that would be great.
Hello.
Okay.
Okay, let's take photo.
Okay.
1, 2, 3, smile. Okay, another one. 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And so that pretty much that is the last part. And so now I just want to thank you again so much, Richard, for taking the time to talk with us today. I feel like we've all learned a lot, and we all feel more connected to the Flyway, and we'll be able to maybe look for areas where we could work together between Taiwan and Australia and our other partners along the EAAF in order to conserve migratory shorebirds. I would also like to remind everyone that we have another webinar coming up tomorrow on November 12th. Dr. Peter Vorsek from the Czech Society of Ornithology will be joining us to discuss migratory bird monitoring in Europe and efforts for the new breeding bird atlas there. Hopefully you can join us for that. Again, a special thanks to the Taiwan Forestry Bureau, the Taiwan Endemic Species Research Institute, our moderator, Dr. Yuan, our translators, Nayuka and Tracy Wang, and of course, our speaker, Dr. Richard Fuller. Thank you again, everyone, so much for joining us today, and have a good rest of your day. Goodbye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Richard, I hope I'll see you in person pretty soon.
Exactly. I'm coming to Taiwan as soon as I can get there.
Sure. Great.
That is great. We will take you birding.
Welcome to come.
Yeah.
Okay. Bye now. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you very much for having me.
No problem. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks, Scott. You're a very good moderator. Yeah.
You did a great job. Thank you so much, Dr. Yuan. All right. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.